Sigmund Freud's work, The Ego and the Id, is a short but powerful book that explains how our mind works. Freud was a pioneer in psychoanalysis, and in this work, he tries to describe the human psyche in terms of three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. These are not physical parts of the brain, but rather different ways our mind works and responds to the world. Freud begins by asking a question: if we believe in the idea that there is an unconscious part of the mind, something we are not fully aware of, how do we explain the difference between what we know, that is conscious thought, and what we don't know, unconscious thought? Earlier in his work, Freud had divided the mind into the conscious, preconscious, and subconscious. But now he thinks that this model does not explain everything. Instead, he introduces the structure of the mind with the id, the ego, and the superego. He starts with the id. The id is the oldest and most primitive part of the mind. It is present from birth and contains our most basic instincts, especially those related to desire, hunger, sexuality, and aggression. The id works according to the pleasure principle. That means it wants what it wants immediately, without thinking about consequences or reality. It does not care about rules or morals. It is completely unconscious and it speaks in the language of dreams and fantasies. Next, Freud describes the ego. The ego develops from the id as a person grows and starts interacting with the real world. The ego tries to balance the desires of the id with the demands of reality. It works by the reality principle. That means it delays gratification when necessary. If the id wants something dangerous or unacceptable, the ego tries to find a safer or more realistic way to satisfy it. The ego is partly conscious and partly unconscious. It is a part of us that thinks, plans, makes decisions, and controls actions. But even though it seems to be in charge, the ego is constantly under pressure. Then comes the superego. This is the moral part of the mind. It develops later in childhood, usually around the time a child learns rules and values from parents and society. The superego acts like an inner judge. It tells the ego what is right or wrong. It pushes us to act morally and feel guilty when we do something wrong. The superego is not always kind. It can be very strict and harsh, like the id and the ego. It is partly unconscious and partly conscious. Freud explains that the ego has a hard job. It must deal with the wild desires of the ego, the strict rules of the superego, and the real world. This creates tension and anxiety. To handle this anxiety, the ego uses defense mechanism. These are mental tricks that help protect the ego from stress. Examples include repression, that is, pushing painful thoughts into the unconscious, or denial, that is, refusing to accept reality, and projection, that is, seeing your own bad feelings in someone else. These defenses are useful in the short term, but they can create problems if they are used too much. Freud also talks about the role of instincts. He says humans are driven by two basic forces: the life instinct, which is eros, and the death instinct, which is thanatos. The life instinct pushes us towards survival, love, sex, and growth. The death instinct pushes us toward aggression, destruction, and a return to a state without tension, death. These two forces are always at work in the unconscious. The id is the source of these instincts, and the ego tries to manage them. The book also looks at how a person becomes who they are through internal conflict. For example, when a child wants something that their parents say is wrong, that desire is pushed into the unconscious. But it does not go away. It stays there and shapes how the person feels and acts later. This is called repression, and it is a central idea in psychoanalysis. Freud says many psychological problems come from these repressed ideas. Freud discusses how the ego can become weakened or divided. Sometimes the ego becomes overwhelmed by the id's demands. Other times the superego becomes too powerful and punishes the ego with guilt and shame. In both cases, the person may develop neurosis or anxiety disorders. Freud believes that psychoanalysis can help by making the unconscious conscious, by bringing hidden desires and conflicts into awareness so the person can deal with them. He also explains how identification plays a role in building the ego and superego. Identification means that a person takes on characteristics of someone else, usually a parent or authority figure. The child internalizes the voice of the parent, which becomes a superego. In this way, the external control becomes inner control. But this process can also cause inner conflict if the person feels they can never live up to the moral standards they have learned. Freud shows how dreams, slips of the tongue, and symptoms of mental illness reveal the hidden life of the unconscious. Even when we think we are being rational and in control, the id and the superego are influencing us in ways we do not realize. The ego is just the surface, trying to maintain balance, but much of our mind is hidden beneath. In the end, Freud makes it clear that the ego is not the master of the mind. It is more like a servant trying to keep peace among three demanding forces: the id, superego, and the outside world. The ego has no easy job. It must satisfy the id's desires in ways that won't upset the superego or get the person into trouble in reality.